He was the 8th son, an add-on, a nobody, a throwaway child. His family rarely considered his needs, and they never really worried about his future. They made decisions for him, and they never thought to consult him. And so at a very early age, he learned to do what he was told, when he was told, and how he was told. That's how he became a sheep herder. His older brothers refused. It was, after all, below their dignity. And besides, David could do it. Who cared what he thought? He was, after all, the 8th son. The nobody. The throwaway child. We think of him as a great king. History says that perhaps he was the greatest. But you know, I really don't think that meant a lot to him, because his family didn't think of him at all. Remember when the prophet Samuel was sent to his father? God said, "Go to where I tell you, and you will anoint the next king." And so Samuel is sent to Jesse's house, and he walks in, and he says, I have come to see your sons. And how many sons were brought to Samuel? 7. And they all come before Samuel, and God keeps saying, "No, not that one, not that one, not that one." And it happens 7 times. And finally Samuel turns to Jesse and says, "Are all of these your sons?" And Jesse says, "Yeah." And Samuel says, "There are no more?" And Jesse goes, "Oh yeah. He's out in the field." And Samuel says, "Please go get him." David was so unimportant that when a prophet comes and asks to see all your sons, he's not even invited in. And as for that thing with Goliath, do you know that Jesse actually risked his young son's life in order to send luxuries to the other 7 who were on the battlefield? It was worth the risk. After all, it was just David, the 8th son, the throwaway child. Now, in all fairness, fighting Goliath was David's decision. But one has to wonder why it was a small child, a young boy, who volunteered to go fight the giant when he was surrounded by what was considered to be one of the greatest armies of all time. None of those warriors would go. They'd been standing around forever waiting for somebody. And when David finally said, "I'll go," what happened to him? Well, if you read the story that we normally skip over, what happens to him is his older brother gets furious with him. He comes to him and he starts yelling at him, telling him he's only there to try to put himself in the middle of all the action, and that all he wants to do is embarrass him. He's the oldest son. Why didn't he fight Goliath? in that armor? That was Saul's idea. Nobody ever asked David. It was bigger than him. It probably outweighed him. And the only reason he didn't have to end up wearing it was because he was David, the 8th son, the throwaway child. Saul knew that somebody had to fight Goliath, and so it might as well be David. At least he wouldn't lose one of his prime warriors. And speaking of Saul, was it David's decision to go be his musician? No. Did David deliberately set out to be a folk hero by killing Goliath? No. Did he ask to be Saul's son-in-law? No, at least not at first. He didn't even ask to become king. As a matter of fact, David was anointed to be the second king, and you know what he did? He supported Saul. Saul in all of his craziness. Saul, every time he tried to kill David. David had opportunities to kill Saul, but what did he do? He saved his life. He kept others from mutinying against Saul, and what did he get in return? Saul hated him. Saul attempted to kill him. And finally, Jonathan, his only friend, said, "You got to get out of here. If you don't leave, my father will kill you." And so David left. He left. And who went with him? Saul was going to kill him. He needed friends. He needed help. And who was willing to go? Well, remember the family who couldn't seem to remember him? They were among the first to show up. But it wasn't because they were concerned for David. What had them worried was that Saul's animosity toward David was going to spill over onto them. And if that was the case, then they would be the ones who would be killed and not David. They had to go find David. I mean, if Saul is after you, where's the safest place to be but with a giant killer, right? So they went. But given their mixed motives, do you really think David felt blessed? Do you think he really wanted to trust them? So who did come to help him? Who could he rely on for support? Well, according to the scriptures, it was, I quote, "Everyone who was in trouble, in debt, or in desperate circumstances." In other words, the only people he could trust were a bunch of misfits, just like him. As far as the privileged few of that ancient society were concerned, David was where he finally belonged, hiding in a cave with a bunch of outlaws. So much for being the king of Israel. Well, at least that's what the people were thinking. God, on the other hand, saw things a little differently. God looked at that group of outcasts, along with the misfit who was supposed to be their leader. And do you know what he saw? He saw the beginning of a new nation. He saw holy people in the making. In his book, Leap Over a Wall, Eugene Peterson says that those who gathered around David, they were made by God. They were a people that were not defined by where they came from or what they did, but by what God did in them and for them. The world saw them as sinners, as outcasts. And you know, over the next 10 years, David was in exile. And like Moses before him and Jesus after him, he no doubt wondered why God had seen fit to bless him with a group of unpredictable, unmanageable, unreasonable malcontents. The 600 who gathered around David, they didn't always listen. They weren't always willing to do what he asked. And on more than one occasion, David just simply wanted to throw his hands up and tell God the same thing Moses did. They're your people, you take them. I don't want them. But in those 10 years, David learned a very important lesson. A lesson that not only made him among the most faithful of all believers, but an outstanding king. What David learned was that God does not look for perfect or powerful people when building a foundation for the church or the kingdom. God looks instead at a person's heart, at those who have nothing else to lose, so they're willing to be molded, mentored, and led. It was in the cave at Adullam that David finally learned the importance of looking at people's hearts, at what they have to offer rather than what they lack, at their willingness to learn rather than what they already knew. What David learned was that through the grace of God, even an eighth child, the throwaway one, can become a king. He learned that a band of marauders can become a mighty nation. And when he became a king, he knew that even the Israelites could be God's chosen people. Now, if God can do all of that with people like them, what do you think he could do with a group like us? They became a new nation. Maybe we can help build the kingdom Christ believed in and died for, even if we happen to be the eighth son, the nobody, the lost sheep, the struggling Pharisee, the deserting disciple, the one who always doubts. God did a miracle with the people at Adullam. They'd been chosen for a mighty task. And so have we. Who would have ever thought it? We are God's chosen people. Thanks be to God. And all God's children say, Amen.